Introduction. The Great Depression had its origins in a period of global economic prosperity that spanned the 1920s. This decade, known to posterity as the Roaring Twenties, was the culmination of the Gilded Age, a sustained period of economic growth in both the United States of America and the world as a whole. During the Roaring Twenties, the United States economy benefited from the growth of manufacturing and technological industries. The growth of these industries led to a rise in manufacturing jobs and the emergence of a prosperous society. Greater prosperity then led to cultural change. Economic growth increased the standard of living for the middle class and the working class. A consumer culture emerged. Art, music, and literature flourished, laying the groundwork for modern American popular culture. Economic and cultural changes influenced collectively the politics of the United States. Prosperity led to greater popular engagement with politics, while improved communications, such as the emergence of the radio as a consumer good, allowed candidates and politicians easier access to the electorate. While many of these changes were centered in the United States, they nonetheless affected the world as a whole, making the Roaring Twenties a global phenomenon. In short, this was a revolutionary decade in which sustained economic growth led to a transformation of society. Despite sustained economic growth and improvements in quality of life, signs of weakness lurked beneath the surface. Despite the growth of industry and the rapid advancement of technology, the agricultural sector of the United States remained stagnant as overproduction led to extensive migration to the cities. Increased immigration led to the rise of xenophobia and a series of draconian anti-immigration measures. From 1919 to 1932, the prohibition of alcohol led to a loss of government revenue and the rise of criminal syndicates in many of the major U.S. cities. Most importantly, the laissez-faire policies of the government led to an unregulated speculation and uncontained stock market growth. Collectively, these weaknesses set the stage for the Great Depression. Chapter 1. The Gilded Age and World War I. While the Roaring Twenties constituted a prelude to the Great Depression, they also formed the final act in an earlier era known as the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age in the United States of America lasted roughly from the end of the Civil War in 1865 until the stock market crash of 1929 that marked the start of the Great Depression. Most of the processes which defined the Roaring Twenties, such as economic growth, cultural change, and increased political engagement, were themselves culminations of processes that had spanned the entire Gilded Age. The most dramatic development of the Gilded Age was a series of technological advances referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. The products of this era included electric lights, telecommunications, motion pictures, and the first automobiles and airplanes. These developments were enabled by, and in turn enabled, a complete transformation of the global economy. Communication became virtually instant thanks to the telephone and telegraph. Physical mobility improved thanks to the steam turbine and internal combustion engine, as well as the automobiles, airplanes, ships, and train engines that they enabled. The main beneficiary of the Second Industrial Revolution was the United States. The expansion of the American railroad network allowed for the transportation of agricultural products and mine minerals from remote centers of resource extraction to industrial production areas. At the same time, immigration boomed. Millions of people arrived in the United States each year. They were attracted to manufacturing jobs and a rising standard of living. If the Gilded Age constituted the long-term background of the Roaring Twenties, the short-term background was World War I. This conflict, referred to at the time as the Great War, lasted from 1914 to 1918 and devastated Europe and much of the world. Along with the Great Depression, it was the first of two major crises that would end the global period of economic growth resulting from the Second Industrial Revolution. The event that sparked the war was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austro-Hungarian Empire by Serbian nationalists on June 28, 1914. This prompted the outbreak of war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia 1 month later on July 28. This could have remained a small regional war. However, it quickly escalated into a global conflict as Russia came to Serbia's aid. This triggered a confrontation between the two military alliances that had formed in Europe in the decades before 1914. By the end of the year, an alliance referred to as the Central Powers that consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were at war with the Allied Powers, a rival alliance whose most important members were Russia, France, and the United Kingdom. World War I was the first major European war since the defeat of Napoleon and proved to be one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The war had started in an era of global economic growth and optimism. By the time it was over, it had claimed the lives of over 20 million soldiers and civilians and redrawn the map of Europe. World War I may have led to a global economic downturn, if not for the unlikely involvement of the United States. While the United States was officially neutral for much of the war, American companies used this neutrality to their advantage. These companies shipped supplies and loaned money to the Allied powers in Europe. After 3 years of neutrality, the United States entered the war on the side of the Allied powers in 1917 and sent a force of around 2 million men to Europe. This contributed to the eventual Allied victory. This was a relatively inexpensive involvement for the United States. American soldiers had a relatively low mortality rate. The short duration of the United States involvement meant that less money went into the war effort. However, this was still a costly venture and led to the creation of a wartime economy in the United States. Under the wartime economy, the United States government took a larger than usual role in the management of the national economy. This included mobilizing the population to both fight the war and produce munitions and other supplies for the war effort. It required the creation of institutions of economic control that had previously not existed and a protracted propaganda campaign to encourage the population to support the war. When the war ended, the government and citizens of the United States faced the challenge of dismantling the wartime economy and transitioning to a peacetime economy that had existed prior to the war. Their response to this challenge, while not immediately or universally effective, was the process that started the economic growth of the Roaring Twenties. Chapter 2. The Economy, Recovery, and Deregulation. The chief business of the American people is business. Calvin Coolidge. Economic change was the driving force behind the Roaring Twenties. After World War I, the United States underwent a brief period of recovery from 1918 to 1920, followed by a brief depression from 1920 to 1921. When the Depression of 1920 to 1921 ended, the economy entered a period of sustained growth that continued until 1929. All three of these phases, the initial recovery, the Depression of 1920 and 1921, and the ensuing era of growth, occurred because of government policies. During the wartime economy, the government became heavily involved in the day-to-day business of the country. President Woodrow Wilson belonged to the Democratic Party and supported the progressive movement. This political movement spanned both of the major parties and promoted, among other things, direct democracy through the expansion of voting rights and increased government involvement in the economy via measures such as a federal income tax. As a progressive, Wilson had strengthened labor unions by using them to mobilize workers for the wartime economy. After the war, he favored a slow demobilization of the United States population and a gradual transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. Wilson was unable to accomplish this, largely because the conservative wing of the rival Republican Party, who voted for immediate demobilization, controlled Congress. Congress was not comfortable with the continued involvement of the federal government in running the economy and desired a return to the laissez-faire policies of the pre-war period, in which the government did not interfere in the economy. In the short term, rapid demobilization struck a blow to the economy of the United States. Government contracts related to the war effort were canceled immediately, putting millions of United States citizens that had previously mobilized for the war effort out of work. In Europe, soldiers who had been raised to fight the war were demobilized at a similarly rapid pace. Almost the entire American Expeditionary Force had been sent home by the middle of 1919. This rapid demobilization led to a brief period of increased unemployment, as demobilized soldiers and laborers in government employ found themselves without work. By the end of 1919, however, the economy entered a post-war boom because of the continued operation of certain wartime institutions, such as the Railroad Administration, as well as agrarian recovery following the return of soldiers and wartime laborers to their farms. While this recovery did not last, it offered a sign of optimism and was the first indication of the dramatic transformations that were about to occur. Despite the decade's reputation as one of growth and prosperity, the 1920s began with one of the most dramatic economic collapses in the history of the United States. The Depression of 1920 to 1921 had two main causes. The first was a dramatic reduction in government spending after the end of World War I. This meant that the amount of money that United States citizens paid in taxes was greater than the amount of money that the government put back into the economy through contracts and purchases. This led to economic deflation. the purchasing power of the United States dollar decreased. Deflation was especially damaging to farmers and others who produced raw materials. Agrarian recovery after World War I had led to increased production of food and animal products. However, deflation meant that these products were not worth as much as they had been previously, while overproduction led to increased competition and decreased demand. The Depression of 1920 to 1921 in many ways never ended for America's farmers. The farmers did not experience the dramatic recovery enjoyed by the industrial sector. In the short term, the industrial sector was affected similarly, with dramatic cuts to production and rising urban unemployment. However, the reduced cost of raw materials ultimately allowed the industrial sector to profit at the expense of the agricultural sector. Cheaper materials allowed manufacturers to increase production. In 1920, Woodrow Wilson decided not to run for re-election. For the election of 1920, the Democrats nominated Governor James M. Cox of Ohio, a progressive politician and an outspoken supporter of President Wilson. The Republicans nominated another Ohioan, Senator Warren G. Harding. While the Republican Party still had a large number of progressive politicians, the party rejected these politicians in the 1920 primary election and instead chose Harding, an anti-progressive candidate who favored a laissez-faire economic policy. This proved to be a wise move. Despite having overseen a very successful presidency, Wilson's term in office had ended with one of the worst depressions in United States history. There was a widespread belief that progressivism had run its course and ultimately failed. Harding's campaign slogan advertised a return to normalcy. Normalcy in this case did not just refer to putting the horrors of World War I in the past, but also moving away from the progressive policies that had dominated United States electoral politics since the start of the century. Under both Wilson and his most notable predecessor, the progressive Republican Theodore Roosevelt, Harding won in a landslide. He took 60% of the popular vote and swept every state outside of the American South. Harding's election marked the start of an era of laissez-faire politics that would last for over a decade. Under Harding and his two successors, Calvin Coolidge, who held the presidency from 1923 to 1929, and Herbert Hoover, who held the presidency from 1929 to 1933, the federal government of the United States attempted to support the growth of American business by not interfering in the economy and by allowing business owners to do as they wished. Laissez-faire means to let be, and the conservative factions who opposed the progressives in both the Democratic and Republican parties advocated letting the marketplace be. In keeping with this policy, Harding attempted to alleviate the post-war economic depression by reducing taxes. In doing so, he targeted two specific types of taxes. The first taxes were those that had been raised during World War I in order to support the war effort. The second taxes were income taxes imposed upon businesses. In contrast to his laissez-faire policy on income taxes, Harding took an interventionist policy on foreign imports and sought to increase tariffs on foreign goods, particularly those that competed with the most beleaguered sectors of the United States economy. Harding's overall policy aimed to create room for American businesses to flourish while protecting them from foreign competition. If one were to look only at the years from 1920 to 1929, it would seem that these policies were successful. The withdrawal of the government from the private sphere allowed businesses more room to maneuver. At the same time, the declining cost of raw materials resulting from the Depression of 1920 to 1921 allowed manufacturers to create significant profits with minimal expenditure. The result was a manufacturing boom that resulted in both the creation of new products and the creation of new industrial sector jobs. Rising employment then led to greater expenditures and the strengthening of the United States dollar. This, in turn, encouraged investment and speculation, which both served to fuel the expansion and growth of the industrial sector. The ultimate effect was the runaway growth of the economy and the creation of a rapidly expanding urban society. Chapter 3. Technology, Mass Production, and Consumer Culture. A business that makes nothing but money is a poor business. Henry Ford. Post-war deregulation was not the only factor that allowed for the growth of American manufacturing. Another important factor in industrial growth was a series of innovations in the manufacturing process that came to be known as mass production. Mass production techniques applied innovative technology to the manufacturing process. They relied on assembly lines in which products were assembled in a methodical fashion from interchangeable parts. On the assembly line, each laborer had a single responsibility, which usually required a minimum of training or effort. When possible, machines were used in the place of laborers, thus reducing labor expenses and allowing for a greater overhead. While mass production had its roots in the industrial revolutions of the 19th century, it reached an unprecedented peak in the Roaring '20s and enabled the creation of the consumer culture that was one of the era's defining features. The father of the modern assembly line was an entrepreneur from the state of Michigan named Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company. Up until the 1920s, the Ford Motor Company's main product was the Model T, an automobile that was first introduced in 1908 and which is remembered today as the world's first consumer automobile. The story of the Model T in many ways parallels the story of American manufacturing in general. When the Model T was introduced in 1908, the Ford Motor Company produced each car individually and made them to order. This limited the number of cars that Ford could produce, increasing the cost of owning a Model T, and ensured that the Ford Motor Company could never fully meet consumer demand. In 1910, the Ford Motor Company moved its manufacturing operations to a new and larger plant. Better facilities and the employment of a larger workforce allowed for the use of rudimentary assembly line techniques. This, in turn, enabled greater production, and the cost of the Model T dropped, increasing both supply and demand. The largest breakthrough in the Model T's career came in 1913, when Henry Ford used electric motors to create a moving assembly line. This reduced the burden on human labor and allowed for a remarkably efficient manufacturing process in which a complete automobile could be produced in less than 2 hours. This caused the cost of the Model T to drop even further, and production continued to increase until the entry of the United States into World War I in 1917. The true heyday of the Model T began in 1920. World War I and the post-war depression caused production to drop temporarily and caused prices to rise. However, the favorable conditions that accompanied the end of the depression of 1920 to 1921 allowed the Ford Motor Company to increase production to an unprecedented level. In 1922, for the first time ever, Ford produced over 1 million Model Ts. In 1924, the price of the Model T dropped to less than $300. While the price would rise again, the level of production remained steady until 1927, when Ford stopped producing the Model T and replaced it with the newer and more advanced automobile, the Model A. As the first successful example of a mass-produced product, the Ford Model T set a standard which other manufacturers followed. The Ford Motor Company's main competitor, General Motors, adopted similar mass production techniques, using them to create innovative, higher-end automobiles. Mass production spread beyond the automobile industry and allowed for the creation of affordable, high-tech home appliances such as radio sets, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, and washing machines. This, in turn, contributed to the creation of a consumer culture. While the rise of mass production and the corresponding decrease in the cost of goods allowed a consumer culture to emerge, another factor was the rise of credit and deferred payments. This was yet another innovation pioneered by Henry Ford. In 1913, the same year that Ford introduced the moving assembly line to his factory in Detroit, he created an installment plan for those who wished to purchase a Model T. The installment plan was, essentially, a loan from the Ford Motor Company for the purchase of a new car. Under the installment plan, a consumer could provide a down payment on a new Model T and then make regular payments over the coming months and years until the total cost of the car was paid off. This furthered Ford's goals of marketing his product to the middle class instead of the wealthy. The essence of consumer culture revolved around the purchase of non-essential goods that had formerly been luxuries. Prior to the 1920s, most people in the United States spent the majority of their money on food, clothing, and other essentials of life. While such necessities did not become any less necessary in the 1920s, the price of purchasing them did not rise. At the same time, mass production caused the price of manufactured goods to decline, while increased employment put more money in the average American's pocket. The rise of credit and deferred installment payments further reduced the need to save money in order to afford particularly expensive goods. The result was a massive increase in spending, particularly among the urban middle class. At the high end, consumer goods included complex machinery, such as automobiles. At the lower end, they included simple products, such as cigarettes and newspapers. The necessities of life became consumer goods themselves, with the mass production of clothing and the development of processed food. For the most part, consumer culture was limited to the middle class, but with rapid urbanization and the growth of manufacturing infrastructure, the middle class continued to grow. While the increased employment and reduced prices of mass production had helped create a consumer culture increased spending and led to the growth of the retail and service industries, with entire business models emerging in response to new technologies. Growing car ownership led to the expansion of the American highway system. Along the newly built and renovated highways, an entire ecosystem of innovative businesses emerged, all of which catered to long-distance drivers. Auto camps allowed drivers to pay for the use of the campsite for spending the night during a long-distance journey. Later, these were replaced by motor hotels or motels, which provided inexpensive rooms at locations near the highway. Gas stations emerged to enable drivers to refuel and continue their journey for a theoretically limitless distance. Roadside restaurants, cafes, and food stands provided nourishment. In the cities themselves, businesses emerged specializing in the repair, maintenance, and customization of automobiles. In short, the automobile did not just stimulate the economy by providing employment and a desirable product, but also enabled the creation of entirely new businesses that responded to the demands of automobile owners. The rise of affordable manufactured goods also led to the creation of retail chain stores. Retail stores specialized in purchasing goods in large quantities from a manufacturer or producer and selling them at a profit. These had existed in the United States since the 19th century, but had primarily been either high-end department stores such as Macy's in New York City or small-scale local businesses. In the 1920s, the supply of and demand for consumer goods rose to such a level that retail stores could proliferate and expand. Retailers opened new stores that became chains and developed retail empires that spread across the country. These retailers included drugstores, convenience stores, and supermarkets, as well as larger department stores that sold a wide variety of usually high-end manufactured goods. Department stores would often extend lines of credit in the same manner as the automobile manufacturers and allowed their clientele to buy now, pay later. Other services developed chains of their own. These services included the service stations that sold gas and repaired automobiles along the nation's highways, as well as banks, which offered savings and loans to the growing consumer class. The revolution that started in manufacturing created a runaway cycle of growth by creating a class of consumers, while at the same time creating products that generated their own demands. The production of these goods and their delivery and sales to the consumers created even more employment. The growth of the retail sector and personal credit further facilitated the exchange of goods and money. This led to an unprecedentedly affluent population, particularly in the cities. Increasing use of automobiles and the radio simplified long-distance communications and linked the distant population centers of the United States and, ultimately, the Western world into an ongoing cultural dialogue. The result of this was the birth of modern popular culture in a form which has since been labeled mass culture. Chapter 4. Culture, Communications, and Mass Culture. Yesterday's home runs don't win today's games. Babe Ruth. Most discussions of the 1920s begin with the culture. This was an era of unprecedented cultural dynamism, with entire forms of art and performance emerging and conquering the world seemingly overnight. Many of the cultural institutions that we currently take for granted, such as Hollywood cinema, Broadway musicals, modern popular music, and professional sports, either got their start or gained popularity in the 1920s. The enabling force behind all of these cultural developments was the improved communication and mobility that resulted from the rise of the consumer automobile and the development of commercial radio. In addition to its effects on the economy, growing automobile usage influenced the culture of the United States by allowing for greater physical mobility and communication. Automobiles allowed for fast, inexpensive, and independent travel within and between cities. Relatives and friends could visit one another with greater frequency and expand their social circles over a larger geographic spread than before. In addition, car ownership allowed for greater social freedom for women and teenagers who used it as a means of escape from the household and its expectations. Ease of mobility allowed for new venues of entertainment. Cinemas, theaters, and concert halls saw increased attendance and expanded in number. Dance halls emerged as a popular venue catering to rebellious youth. These were music venues that specialized in performances of jazz, blues, swing, and other styles of popular music intended for dancing. The automobile communicated culture and created culture. As a communicative technology, commercial radio may have had an even more powerful effect than the consumer automobile did. Radio technology had existed since the 19th century. World War I had compelled its refinement for use in battlefield communications. Wartime developments in radio technology found peacetime application in the emergence of the radio as a consumer good and a household item. This culminated in the opening of the first commercial radio stations, starting towards the end of 1920. By 1922, commercial radio had exploded, and people across the country could listen to music, news reports, political speeches, religious services, and more without leaving the comfort of their living room. Commercial radio and the spread of dance halls made popular music one of the first beneficiaries of mass culture. The popular music of this era was primarily jazz. Like most of the cultural and technological products in the 1920s, jazz had been around a long time, but obtained unprecedented levels of popularity in the 1920s. Much of this was a result of commercial radio, which frequently broadcast both live and recorded performances. This increased public exposure to music in general and allowed for genres of music like jazz and blues to gain in popularity. In addition, the spread of dance halls popularized styles of music suitable for dancing. The dance halls of the early 1920s did not feature jazz, but rather older dance music. Their attendees participated in older dances such as the waltz, the tango, and the foxtrot. The growing popularity of jazz on the radio led to the development of new jazz-inspired dances such as the Charleston and the Lindy Hop. At the same time, jazz music evolved to be more suitable for use as dance music. This result was a period remembered as the Jazz Age, in which upbeat jazz, later referred to as swing or big band music, was the most popular music in the United States. Much like the popular musicians of the present day, jazz and swing musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Fletcher Henderson were household names. While new styles of music and dance were invented at the dance hall, entirely new forms of entertainment were being popularized in the world of the theater. The first and most revolutionary of these was the emergence of Hollywood cinema. As with automobiles, motion pictures had been an emerging technology prior to World War I. But before World War I, the development of the motion picture as an artistic medium mainly occurred outside of the United States. France and Italy were home to the most successful film industries, but it became a truly global artistic medium with feature films produced in countries around the world. While feature films had become long and sophisticated works of art by the start of World War I, they were inherently experimental. The medium had yet to reach its full potential. This potential came quickly in the 1920s as Hollywood emerged as a global force. From 1920 to 1929, Hollywood produced more feature films per year than it ever had before or it ever has since. These films came to be divided into genres such as westerns, war, and romance. Each genre had its own artistic conventions and appealed to a particular audience. They were primarily silent films with music provided by a live pianist or synchronized soundtrack and with dialogue and narration provided by title cards. Without the ability to present spoken dialogue, films relied upon physical action to capture the audience's attention. Actors such as Charlie Chaplin and Lon Chaney Sr. rose to stardom owing to their unique abilities to act using their bodies instead of their voices. The rise of the cinema initiated dramatic changes in the conventional stage theater. The 1920s was the first golden age of the Broadway musical. In many ways, it was the decade in which musical theater took on its modern form. Broadway had emerged as New York City's theater district in the 19th century. Musical theater became one of Broadway's main attractions by the start of the 20th century. Musical theater before the 1920s had more in common with classical music and opera than the jazz-inspired musical theater that succeeded it. While many plays were sung or had vocal elements, many Broadway theaters featured spoken, non-musical stage plays as well. At the start of the 1920s, Broadway experienced a crisis as the rise of motion pictures offered a cheaper, more accessible, and oftentimes more visually spectacular form of entertainment with which Broadway could not compete. As with many other institutions of the 1920s, Broadway responded by adapting to change. Broadway shows began to use jazz and jazz-inspired music to emphasize the spectacle of the show over the story. The result was an era of dazzling and elaborate musicals fueled by the celebrity of their lead actors and actresses with a relatively minor focus on the story. Cinema and musical theater, like music, produced celebrities and household names whose fame and lifestyles were not unlike the movie stars of the present day. The forces powering the rise of Hollywood and Broadway were the same as those powering the rise of Ford and General Motors. The major studios of Hollywood applied industrial production techniques to the creation of films, dividing creative duties such as writing, directing, set design, and costume design into an assembly line. The ultimate product would be a completed feature film. Mass production techniques were applied in a more literal sense to the manufacture of costumes, props, and sets, as well as to the film, projectors, and screens required for recording, storing, distributing, and displaying the films. The same techniques allowed Broadway theaters to create lavish and spectacular stage plays. In addition to this, both Hollywood and Broadway changed the role of actors through the implementation of contract systems. This would allow a studio or production company to sign a long-term contract with a particular actor or actress who would become an employee of the studio or company and appear in their films or productions. This gave studios and theaters a powerful incentive to promote and advertise their leading stars. Another cultural institution that reached its first pinnacle in the 1920s was professional sports. As with popular music, the rise of professional sports as a form of entertainment resulted from the commercial radio. Radio broadcasts meant that anyone could follow their favorite teams and athletes, even if they could not be physically present to watch them play. As in the present day, Americans followed a variety of sports at the time. However, the most popular sport was baseball. While baseball had already been a popular sport, radio transformed professional baseball into a national obsession. Millions of Americans followed baseball on the radio and in newspapers and traveled to see their favorite teams play. The most famous baseball player of the 1920s was Babe Ruth, a man whose name remains a very recognizable celebrity. In addition to baseball, boxing started the 1920s as a particularly popular sport. Tennis and golf increased in popularity over the course of the decade. Professional football also emerged as a major sport, but collegiate football remained more popular. The mass of mass culture refers to a degree of consistency and standardization in media that previously had not existed. A radio broadcast allowed listeners in a given area to hear the exact same song, news bulletin, or speech, regardless of their precise location. A cinema playing a popular movie would show the same movie to everyone who attended on successive nights. The same movie could be shown in any cinema in the nation. Public advertising and the growing array of consumer goods exposed people to the same products and served to standardize ideas of fashion and the ideal lifestyle. We take this kind of cultural exposure for granted in the present day, but in the 1920s, this was a new phenomenon. A key element of this was the rise of celebrity culture. As with today's celebrities, the celebrities of the 1920s included musicians, athletes, actors, and actresses. These people were not just famous names, but famous faces. The clothes they wore, the dances they performed, and the things they said held power with the American average and allowed them to influence popular culture. The mass culture of the 1920s changed, but never died despite the Depression and World War that would follow. While the faces, fashions, and forms of entertainment have changed, the popular culture of the present day is the same culture that was born in the 1920s. Chapter 5. Society. A crisis of morals and identity. When I sell liquor, it's called bootlegging. When my patrons serve it on Lakeshore Drive, it's called hospitality. Al Capone. While the mass culture of the 1920s won over a great number of young people, it produced a great number of outspoken discontents as well. These included social and religious conservatives from older generations who objected to the music, dance, media, and lifestyle of the youth. They also included rural farmers who did not benefit from the continuing economic growth. This led to a cultural crisis between the old and the young, and between the rural and the urban. This crisis played out on two fronts. The first front consisted of moral points of contention. The key moral issue was the prohibition of alcohol, which began in 1920. Prohibition led to the growth of a thriving underground economy and a rise in organized crime. Prohibition also served as a cornerstone around which moral conservatives framed their arguments against cultural change. Other elements of cultural change which moral conservatives objected to included the liberation of women and the growth of a more socially open and freewheeling youth culture. At the same time, the cultural crisis had an economic front. The key issues of the economic front were the global rise of communism and an expansion of immigration. These issues led to the first Red Scare, a revival of the xenophobic Ku Klux Klan, and the passage of a series of draconian anti-immigration laws. Prohibition stands as the most famous and best remembered cultural battle of the 1920s. The legal foundation for the prohibition of alcohol was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the United States. This amendment was presented in 1917, passed in 1918, and ratified in 1919, despite the veto and objections of President Wilson. After its ratification, Congress passed the National Prohibition Act, which enabled the federal government to enforce the terms of the 18th Amendment. As such, in 1920, the possession, sale, and consumption of alcohol became a crime. The result of prohibition was not an end to the consumption of alcohol, but the emergence of an underground economy. It resulted in moonshiners who brewed and distilled alcoholic beverages, bootleggers who transported them, and people sold and consumed alcohol behind closed doors in establishments called speakeasies. As this economy was both illegal and unregulated, it provided a business opportunity for organized crime. Powerful gangsters emerged in the cities of the United States, where demand for alcohol was high, and legitimate alcohol producers and distributors had been driven out of business by prohibition. The most famous gangster of this era was Al Capone, who became rich enough on the profits of his bootlegging empire to buy off law enforcement agents and operate in public. Capone and other gangsters became celebrities in their own right and engaged in violent and destructive battles with rival gangsters and law enforcement agents, particularly from the Bureau of Prohibition. While prohibition temporarily reduced the consumption of alcohol, it did not eliminate it and indeed created an entirely new set of social problems. The force behind prohibition was the temperance movement, a coalition of religious and socially conservative organizations that had opposed the consumption of alcohol since the early days of the United States. The temperance movement had made a concerted push towards prohibition over the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Having achieved victory with the 18th Amendment and the National Prohibition Act, temperance crusaders turned their attention towards the youth culture of the 1920s. The popularity of jazz music in speakeasies led social conservatives to decry it as the devil's music. Automobiles also became a target for moral outrage, as they enabled young people to escape their households and access dance halls, speakeasies, and other sites of moral decadence. The privacy provided by automobiles presented another problem, as they allowed young people, often unmarried and of different genders, to be alone together. This led to the Model T being nicknamed the bedroom on wheels. The changing role of women in society also provoked the moral conservatives. In 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, allowing women the right to vote for the first time in United States history. This was the result of a decades-long struggle and created a completely new set of political conflicts. Women immediately began to take a larger role in public life and politics. The rise of affordable household appliances such as washing machines and vacuum cleaners reduced the burden of domestic chores and allowed women time to pursue careers and social lives of their own. At the same time, the freewheeling culture of the dance hall and speakeasy led to a change in women's lifestyle and fashion. The 1920s generation of women were derogatorily referred to as flappers. They wore loose clothing suitable for dancing to jazz music, smoked cigarettes, drank alcohol, drove automobiles, and socialized freely with men. The 1920s saw a growing xenophobia, which opened a second front in the cultural crisis. This front revolved around economic issues but was rooted in cultural chauvinism and social inequality. The process that opened the economic front was the rise of communism. In 1917, a series of revolutions in Russia led to the overthrow of the venerable Russian monarchy, the transformation of the old Russian Empire into a communist state, and the Russian withdrawal from World War I. The Russian communists were not immediately successful, but their rise to power set off a series of conflicts in Eastern Europe that continued until the establishment of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, hereafter USSR, in 1922. Despite this, the rise of an independent communist state frightened the United States, which had made laissez-faire, pro-business economic policies a cornerstone of its political identity. A series of post-war strikes and politically motivated bombings in the United States exacerbated this fear and led to a major backlash against labor unions, which were seen as a stepping stone to communism. Strikes were met with violent crackdowns. Federal agents conducted a series of raids against anarchist and socialist political organizations. As a whole, public sentiment turned against labor unions and became explicitly anti-communist. Despite the fact that President Wilson, a progressive, had overseen these raids and crackdowns, the historical progressive support for labor unions tainted the movement and contributed to Harding's victory in the 1920 election. The short-lived Red Scare initiated a general wave of xenophobia and racism that lasted the entire decade. Communism came to be seen as a foreign ideology and associated with foreigners and immigrants. At the same time, the increased labor demand and rising prosperity of the 1920s drew a record number of immigrants to the United States. These immigrants became the target of suspicion and hatred from an increasingly xenophobic population. The main targets of xenophobia were the adherents of religions other than Protestant Christianity that prevailed in much of the United States. Therefore, Catholic and Jewish immigrants encountered particular trouble. In addition, Eastern Europeans were seen as untrustworthy due to cultural differences and the growing influence of communism in Eastern Europe. Organizations opposed to immigration succeeded in lobbying the government to pass the Emergency Quota Act in 1921, which placed limits on the number of immigrants arriving from particular countries, and the Immigration Act of 1924, which tightened these restrictions. At the same time, domestic racism flourished. The labor strikes of 1919 served to embolden disenfranchised minority communities who were determined to fight back against racial violence and not be intimidated. African Americans had participated in World War I, both as soldiers and industrial workers for the wartime economy. After the war, many migrated to the industrial centers of the North and sought work in manufacturing. African American laborers soon developed a reputation as supporters of labor rights and openly advocated for racial equality in the workplace. In the summer of 1919, known as the Red Summer, race riots broke out in cities across the United States. While white people initiated the violence in almost every instance, black people fought back and resisted. The riots claimed the lives of hundreds of victims, most of whom were African American. Racism and xenophobia united in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, hereafter KKK. The KKK had originally formed in the aftermath of the Civil War and had been an effort by white Southerners to prevent the newly emancipated black population of the South from exercising their rights as citizens or from rising above their station. The original KKK made use of vigilante violence and intimidation against African American citizens and white American citizens who supported them. While the KKK was suppressed in the 1870s, it was refounded in 1915. President Wilson held progressive views regarding labor unions and government economic policies. He strongly opposed greater equality for African Americans and all but openly supported the KKK. In the 1920s, the Red Scare and rising immigration, as well as the tacit support of the Wilson administration, gave the KKK new life. It adopted business techniques, not unlike those used by a legitimate businessman like Henry Ford or an illegitimate businessman like Al Capone, with a national hierarchy, an extensive recruiting network, and mass-produced costumes sold as merchandise. Like their predecessors, the KKK of the 1920s engaged in violence, intimidation, and even murder. However, their targets no longer just included African Americans and their white allies. Jewish and Catholic immigrants joined African Americans as targeted groups. By the middle of the decade, the KKK's membership numbered in the millions. The cultural crisis of the 1920s was, therefore, a social crisis. It did not simply concern the forms of music, dance, and entertainment deemed socially acceptable, but rather the station of entire groups of people within society. Women, laborers, African Americans, and immigrants all sought greater equality within society. All experienced varying amounts of opposition from society as a whole. When the government did intervene, it invariably resulted in the loss of life. Prohibition allowed organized criminals to flourish and led to virtual urban warfare between gangsters and federal police officers. Government actions against labor unions, communist groups, and immigrants emboldened the KKK and led to race riots and lynchings. Chapter 6. Politics. The birth of the modern political campaign. America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Warren G. Harding. As with many other aspects of American culture and society, electoral politics underwent a radical change in the 1920s. Due to radios and improved transportation, elections and statements of policy became public affairs, with the distance between politicians and the electorate greatly reduced. The prevailing political ideology was a business-oriented, laissez-faire conservatism that aimed to combat the rising foreign influences of communism and fascism while focusing on economic matters and maintaining moderation in regards to increasingly unstable social and cultural issues. Despite the general sense of caution and restraint from the government, the administrations of the 1920s are remembered for incredible corruption and pandering to special interests. Indeed, poor political leadership ultimately proved one of the weaknesses of American society in the 1920s. In the 1920s, political campaigns became one element in the mass culture that transformed the rest of American society. As with other elements of mass culture, this was because of improvement in communications. Starting with the campaign of 1920, camera crews followed presidential campaigns and created newsreels that were displayed in cinemas, thus reaching a nationwide audience. Candidates adopted public advertising techniques of the sort used by private companies to familiarize the electorate with their names and the issues they represented. The rise of commercial radio had led to radio receivers becoming a household appliance and offered politicians a means of communicating instantly and regularly with a large number of people. The radio also provided live election results. Americans knew who had won an election as the ballots were counted. At his inauguration in 1924, Calvin Coolidge made history by delivering the first presidential address to be broadcast by radio. The issues of the time revolved around maintaining an environment conducive to business and economic growth, confronting the foreign ideologies of communism and fascism, and maintaining social cohesion in an increasingly divided and unstable society. In this regard, Wilson represented the end of an old paradigm, while Harding represented the start of a new paradigm. Wilson had supported labor unions and advocated a foreign policy aimed at spreading American-style democracy overseas. Harding, by contrast, railed against the heroics of Wilsonian foreign policy, advocated an anti-progressive normalcy, and adopted the decidedly anti-Wilsonian campaign slogan, "America First." The chaos of Wilson's final years in office ultimately led to Harding defeating Wilson's hand-picked successor, James Cox. After Harding's death in 1923, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, sought re-election in 1924 on a similar platform of laissez-faire conservatism. He cited the economic success of the Harding years while downplaying the Harding administration's corruption and won in a landslide. Coolidge's main rival in the election, John W. Davis, was a conservative Democrat whose policies were similar to those of Coolidge. Coolidge, to an even greater degree than Harding, advocated a small and unintrusive government. He was soft-spoken, private, and maintained a diminutive figure despite his high office. He was firm in his support of laissez-faire economics, famously stating, "The chief business of the American people is business." At the same time, he opposed the KKK and refrained from public statements on volatile social issues. Herbert Hoover won the presidency in 1928 on a modified version of the Harding and Coolidge platforms, which advocated a slight increase in business regulations and limited support for labor unions. He maintained the foundation of laissez-faire conservatism that had been the basis of the decades' previous Republican platforms. Despite revolutionizing the American political campaign and overseeing a period of great economic growth, the presidents of the 1920s are primarily remembered for their corruption and personal failings. Wilson left office a disgraced president. Conservatives objected to Wilson's support for labor unions and blamed him for the outbreak of labor-related protests after the end of the war. Union members were disillusioned by his inability to stand up to the conservative Congress and his eventual hardline crackdown on union activities. Irish Americans and Italian Americans, who had previously formed a large part of Wilson's base, abandoned him over his support for the increasingly anti-Catholic KKK. While Harding's normalcy proved far more popular with the electorate, his administration was notoriously corrupt. In 1923, it was revealed that Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert Bacon Fall, had rewarded the lease to oil fields in Wyoming and California to private companies who had bribed him for the privilege in advance. When this came out, Fall was convicted of accepting bribes and sent to prison. While Coolidge managed to avoid the scandals that had plagued Harding's administration, His hands-off approach to governance nonetheless failed to address a number of pressing issues. As the industrial sector continued to expand, farmers failed to find the same success and were left behind. Coolidge opposed giving subsidies or financial assistance to the farmers. He stated they had to adopt better business practices in order to succeed in the end. Coolidge's refusal to regulate lending and speculation led to an expansion of private debt and bank loans. Hoover's platform rested on an assumption of virtually unlimited economic growth. His confidence in the continuing strength of the United States economy proved misplaced when the economy crashed shortly after the start of his presidency. In the short run, the conservatism of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover proved a popular and successful alternative to the progressivism of Wilson. However, despite the spectacular economic growth, social progress, and cultural development of this era, the presidents of 1920s America proved either unable or unwilling to address growing regional inequality and social instability. The divisiveness of Wilson's final years gave way to Harding's corruption, Coolidge's indecisiveness, and Hoover's overconfidence. While it cannot be said that these presidents caused the eventual crash of the American economy and the start of the Great Depression, they certainly did nothing to prevent it. Chapter 7. The Roots of the Great Depression. In America today, we are nearer a final triumph over poverty than is any other land. Herbert Hoover. The 1920s were a transitional decade, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The former era was the Gilded Age and the long 19th century, while the latter was the contemporary world as we still know it today. In the short term, however, the Roaring Twenties set the stage for the Great Depression, an extended period of national and global scarcity. While the roots of the eventual post-Depression prosperity lay in the technological, cultural, and economic growth of the 1920s, the roots of the Depression itself lay in the problems that went unaddressed. These included the continued weakness of the agricultural sector and the growth of a culture of spending that involved the unregulated use of debt and credit. They included the deep cultural and social divides between the socially progressive urban population and younger generations and the socially conservative rural population and older generations. They included the rise of xenophobia and racism. They included the inability or unwillingness of the four presidents who oversaw the United States from 1918 to 1929 to address these issues. These underlying weaknesses would come to a head in October of 1929 when the stock market crashed. This set off a period of social and economic collapse and the Great Depression. Warning signs of an impending economic collapse were apparent throughout the 1920s, but became particularly prominent starting in 1927. One of the principal warning signs was a rise in consumer debt. The buy now, spend later culture that had created a consumer culture in the early years of the 1920s ultimately created a false sense of prosperity as people purchased things that they could not truly afford. As consumer debts began to come due, consumer spending declined. At the same time, production continued to increase as manufacturers foresaw a continued rise in consumer spending. This created large surpluses and led to losses of profit among the nation's major manufacturers. At the same time, stock market speculation became popular, in which an investor would make high-risk stock purchases with the intention of eventually selling them at a profit. The buy now, spend later culture extended to speculation as middle-income Americans took bank loans for the purpose of purchasing stocks. As consumer debt rose and banks lost money on speculation, profits began to decrease. This led to a decline in employment and wages. While the economy as a whole continued to strengthen until the last minute, the people and businesses of the United States were under growing pressure. The stock market crash of October 4, 1929, was more of an instigating factor than an underlying cause of the Great Depression. A more significant long-term cause was the ongoing weakness of the American agricultural sector. In many ways, the Depression of 1920 to 1921 was the start of the Great Depression outside of the cities. The farmers who had suffered from overproduction and declining prices in 1920 continued to suffer from the same in 1929. What's more, the growing debt that plagued the urban population had an even greater effect on the farmers, who took loans in order to be able to continue producing, often placing their land as collateral. When these loans came due, they often lost their land. When a great number of loans came due, the local banks that catered to farmers began to fail. As such, the agricultural sector, which provided the food and raw materials on which urban industry depended, was poised to fail. In addition, social and cultural issues made American society vulnerable. The cultural conflicts of the decade did not contribute directly to the collapse of the economy, but nonetheless eroded faith in the American social order. This led to a growing sense of mistrust and enmity between various groups within society. Children, parents, and neighbors found themselves at odds. Families and cities became divided. The economic system of the 1920s, with its focus on credit and speculation, relied upon faith to remain strong. As faith in society declined, so too did faith in the economy. In addition, social conflicts also had very real and material consequences. The rise in organized crime caused by prohibition led to the loss of life as well as the loss of government revenue. The reemergence of the KKK had a similarly deleterious effect as it attacked the prosperous and socially progressive culture of the cities and discouraged immigrants and minorities from becoming successful. When the economy finally collapsed, many Americans had nobody that they could trust. Herbert Hoover found himself overseeing a society that was incapable of pulling itself back together. Beneath the seeming strength and determination of the United States in the 1920s lay a hidden vulnerability. This vulnerability lurked beneath the surface at all times and was visible to those who looked closely and obviously in hindsight. When the golden years ended in late 1929, it took many by surprise, despite the seemingly widespread warning signs. At the start of 1929, the Roaring Twenties were at their peak, and by the end of the year, the Great Depression had begun. Until the last moment, the economy and society of the United States and the world continued to roar. We hope you enjoyed reading this book as much as we enjoyed creating it. If you did, the team would greatly appreciate your feedback on Amazon or your favorite forum. Please sign up for the learning list at in60learning.com to receive free ebooks, audiobooks, and updates on our new releases. Happy reading, the In60 Learning Team.